So when we look at early Rome, they have some basic values that are summarized on the right side of the screen. The mos maiorum is the kind of the custom of the majority. What are most people doing? So for the Romans, everybody's doing it is pretty much the rule. Individuality is not necessarily a good thing for them. They want to look at what is the need of the community? What is the idea of what the community thinks you should be doing? The second one, pietas, is connected to this. Our word piety comes from this word, but pietas is all about obligation, and it's your obligation to your family, your obligation to the gods, and your obligation to Rome. This is a little bit like I think the Marines say, family, God, and country. Okay, so something like that. But to me, the big word there is obligation. You don't think about what do I want to do, it's what do I need to do for other people? What do other people need me to do? So the whole focus of Roman values is very much on community, not on the individual. The Republic, as it's established, is fairly complicated, as you can see in this chart, but the whole gist is to keep any one person from getting power. So there are two main groups in Rome: the patricians, the elites, the founding fathers, so to speak, of the city, and then the plebeians, everybody else. So there's a small group of patricians and a large group of plebeians. When the Republic is first established, the patricians have pretty much all the real power in the Republic. The plebeians have an assembly, but they don't have a lot of influence on lawmaking. They don't have access to the upper level offices, the major magistrates like the consuls. These all come from the patricians. And over the next 200 years, the plebeians are going to use non-violent protest to influence changes, reforms to this system that's going to give them more influence on the government. They're going to get their own assembly that can make laws that eventually are laws binding on everyone. First, it's just laws for them. And they're going to get these officials, the tribunes, who can veto the Senate. The Senate is composed of lifetime members from the patrician class, and their role is to guide, to advise the consuls. Okay, but they don't actually make laws, they just advise on them. The executive power is split amongst these various roles, but the two primary ones are the consuls. They hold that office for 1 year. They are elected and by the assembly. And there's two of them, so they hopefully can balance one another out. If there is an emergency, let's say Rome is being attacked, they can name an emergency dictator who has full control, doesn't have to consult with anybody, but that control is for a maximum of 6 months. Okay. So dictators aren't a bad thing, but they are a temporary, only an emergency kind of thing. Okay. So we're trying to avoid monarchy by splitting the power up. We would call this today separation of powers, and we have 3 branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. This is similar to what they're trying to do. Okay, so Rome is in the middle of the Italian peninsula, and the Italian peninsula is not very wide, so seafaring is going to be a big deal. Rome itself is not on the coastline. It's up a river from the coastline, which actually helps shelter them somewhat from invasion, but still gives them access for trade. And so when they decide to expand, this model of consolidate, expand that we've seen throughout the semester, they are going to go first in the peninsula. To the north of the Italian peninsula, there are mountains, the Alps. So that's a bit of a barrier that they have to decide if they want to try and cross. It's much easier to go throughout the peninsula, and then of course to see what's going on across the water. And the advantage of looking at what's going on across the water is that it's going to help them with trade. The major trade personalities at this time were the Phoenicians. You remember the Phoenicians from like week 2. And Carthage was a major Phoenician city. So their competitors in terms of Mediterranean trade are the Phoenicians, kind of led by Carthage. So they spread throughout Italy, and then they start looking at this island of Sicily off the toe of the boot. And this is where they're going to get into an argument with Carthage, because Carthage had some influence here, and the Romans want to have influence here. And so they're going to start fighting about Sicily in the First Punic War. But they're not really fighting just about Sicily. They're fighting over who's going to control trade in the Mediterranean. And they're going to fight several wars with Carthage. The first one, they win. The second one, they win. The third one, they win. Okay. So they're going to win each time. And at the end, they're going to just completely destroy the city of Carthage so that they can be done fighting with them. And you can kind of see the red on the map, the areas that they end up with, because after they're done with the Punic Wars, they get involved in wars in Greece and Macedonia, which they say are to liberate the Greeks from foreign control, but they replace that foreign control with their own control. So they take over Greece. And the next place they're going to go is to the east, to the old Persian Empire, where there's a lot of money. The Punic Wars had lasted for many, many years, and because the Roman army was composed primarily of farmers, when the farmers went home to their farms after a couple of decades, their farms were in ruins or very difficult to bring back to good farming state. So many farmers chose to abandon their farms or to sell them to wealthy senators. And these wealthy senators create these huge estates called latifundia, and these farmers move into the city hoping to find work. But there's this flood of farmers who had been soldiers into the city. There's high unemployment, overcrowding, the sanitation system's not really prepared for them. All kinds of issues arise. These two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, try to institute reforms that would give land back to the farmers, give them a basis for serving once again in the military, because there was a land-owning requirement to be a soldier at that time. But this would have meant taking land away from the senators, who did not like that idea. And Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus both end up dead as a result of their reform efforts. Gaius Gracchus is the next big player on the stage. Gaius Marius. He comes in and he institutes a major military reform, not a land reform this time, a military reform. He makes it so that you don't have to own land to serve in the military, so that those unemployed farmers can become soldiers again. And this sounds wonderful, but it causes all kinds of problems, and it makes the soldiers see their generals as their patrons and makes the armies into kind of personal armies. And he's going to fight a civil war with a guy named Sulla, who we'll talk about next. And Sulla also feels that he has the best interests of Rome at heart. He gets involved in the civil war with Marius. Then he gets involved in a civil war with the Senate itself. And he says he's saving the Republic. He makes himself a dictator. And he doesn't stay dictator for 6 months. He says, I'm going to be a dictator until the job of saving the Republic is done. And he comes into Rome and he makes lists of his enemies who then disappear. And that's called proscription. So violence. We see violence picking up. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus are killed. Now we see Sulla openly killing his enemies. A man who had come to attention under Sulla was Pompey. Pompey was a new man, which meant no one from his family had served in the Senate. He was a general. He had a lot of big military victories that made him famous. He fought a war against the pirates in the Mediterranean, which made the people who ran trade on the sea happy. He fights a victorious war with this Eastern ruler Mithridates, and then he gets into some issues with the Senate about how his soldiers are going to be treated when they retire and what's going to happen to the land that he conquered. And instead of killing everybody, he looks for political allies, and he finds them in these two gentlemen, Crassus and Julius Caesar. And they become known as the First Triumvirate, which is a fancy Latin way to say group of three dudes. Okay. And you've probably never heard of Crassus, but I'm sure you've heard of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was from a very old family. They trace themselves back to men who had helped drive the Etruscan kings out of Rome, but they didn't have a lot of money. Crassus was a successful general. He had led Rome to victory against the rebel gladiator Spartacus. But he had also become a very wealthy slumlord, building cheap housing for the influx of families that came in after the Punic Wars. So, kind of prestigious name plus money with Crassus. They were successful politically until some key factors changed. Crassus died, which left just Pompey and Caesar. Pompey had married Caesar's only legitimate child, Julia, and they were a good match for one another, but when Julia died in childbirth, there was a lot of tension between Pompey and Caesar, and that tension built as Julius Caesar went off to Gaul, which we would call France today, across the Alps, and sent back reports of his glories in battle, and kind of became his own public relations department. So Caesar ended up fighting a civil war with Pompey and the Senate, and if you know anything about Julius Caesar, you know that that did not turn out really well for Caesar in the end. He wins the civil war. He becomes dictator for life, which is totally in violation of the 6-month emergency dictator position, and he is assassinated on the Ides of March. And we'll be looking a little bit at his assassination and why that happened in our activities this week. Those are the big names, so when you are doing your reading, you'll have some idea who they're talking about and a little bit of what they look like, although you can imagine noses on them because they did have noses, but they've broken off in these busts. Okay. Also, as you're visualizing, notice the hair. Marius has kind of a receding hairline. Sulla has this fantastic head of hair. Pompey has a fantastic head of hair. Caesar has the receding hairline. Actually becomes a popular haircut. So